This video is sponsored by. Yeah, I don't have that kind of clout. At least, not yet. Well, guys, I'm gonna be honest. Okay, more than what I usually try to be. Reviewing recent films was never really part of my ambition as far as this channel is concerned, but sometimes inspiration gets the better of you. Or rather, the cathartic relief of a really good Pixar sequel in over 10 years. It just really gets the creative juices flowing, you know? Oh! That sounded less gross in my head. Seriously, the moment the usual content creators I watch said it's good, I closed the videos to avoid spoilers and rushed to the movie theater at the earliest convenience. Probably owed to the constant disappointment I've witnessed from Pixar the past couple of years, but we'll get to that in a bit. With all that being said though, doing this kind of thing is more or less uncharted territory for me as a content creator. Usually when it comes to making video essays and whatnot, I got a truckload of rewatches and analysis up my sleeve. Analyses? Analyses? What is the plural? Anyways, but here, all I got is the one viewing and everything I could remember or hear being talked about. So if a couple things aren't up to these imaginary standards I'm putting on myself, please bear with me. You've probably heard this from plenty of other randos on the internet throughout the past decade or so. What do you mean it's been 14 years? Pixar has kinda gained a reputation for sequels that really fail to capture the appeal or quality of their predecessors. Except that one time they didn't. If you've been on this website long enough, or even Twitter for that matter, yeah, I'm still not calling it X by the way, this is probably not news to you. Regardless, I'd like to believe that these thoughts are genuine because I agree with the gist of it. Sequel after sequel, courtesy of this company, and most of the time I was underwhelmed, unpleasantly subverted, or just downright disappointed, and by the looks of it, I'm not the only one. Every time one of these sequels was on the way when I was younger, I was more or less thrilled with the prospect of Finding Nemo 2, or Cars 2. Okay, maybe not that second one. Seriously, the moment I finished that first teaser, this was more or less what I was thinking.
Oh my god, bro.
Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck, man?
What was with that whole contrived secret agent shtick? At least when the Loud House did it, the ideas were pre-established throughout the series. Lincoln's a big fan of his world's equivalent of James Bond. Heck, his whole 12th birthday was themed around it. He's no stranger to getting too much into said character, which plays a big role in the movie. His grandpa was getting remarried, and it was already established that his soon-to-be grandmother is a retired spy. They were working with ideas that already existed. Do I think this warranted a whole hour-and-a-half movie? In either instance? Maybe not, but maybe we'll get to that in another video. The point is that with Cars, it all just comes out of nowhere. What made them think that anyone outside of naive kids and the parents that deal with them would genuinely care? Wow. If I had a nickel for every time an iconic kids franchise got a film with really sporadic spy elements, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right? I'd say my first impression spoke volumes because I was only 12 at the time, and you could almost blame this film entirely for this sense of cinematic cynicism I've built over the years. Every time I walked out of the theater for films I was willing to watch, I immediately thought that the first one was better, by a long shot. It felt like these films were serviceable, but even as a kid, teenager, or as of now, young adult, I could smell the mediocrity from a mile away. Nowadays, and for the most part, I could pinpoint why that was. I mean, I've heard it all from myself. The villain sucks, the premise is redundant, yada yada yada. Yes, Par family, we've known Jack has had powers for 14 freaking years by that point. You don't gotta keep repeating it like we're idiots. How do you think he managed to foil Syndrome's kidnapping before you got to do anything about it? Think, Helen! And you. Oh, I got a lot to say about you. But, you're technically not even a sequel, so I'm gonna spare you for now. Mostly. Sometimes the premise is just dumb. It honestly felt like writers just brainstormed ideas, wrote them down, slapped them onto a dartboard, and hoped for the best. How did we go from an overcompetitive douchebag who learns to slow down, literally and figuratively, to whatever happened in Cars 2? What am I saying? Honest Trailers has known the answer for 7 years.
From the studio who brought you Ratatouille and Up comes the movie that paid for all of them. Money.
There's more issues with these films than just jarring contrasts in narrative and whatnot, but we'll get to all that. In one case, the biggest issue wasn't that the film was lousy in overall quality. Hey, for better or worse, it won that Oscar for a reason, but rather, there was too much unpleasant character derailment, and the messaging from its predecessors was severely undermined. Hey Woody, remember when you spurred Andy into giving away the toys because you didn't want them stuck in an attic for an indefinite amount of time? You know, because you really care about them, and realize throughout the third film that you're a family and should look out for one another? Don't take that as my interpretation, by the way. He more or less said it himself.
No, it's my fault for leaving you guys. From now on, we stick together.
Yeah, screw them. They'll be fine without you. You got Buzz's blessing, even though he was clearly the biggest advocate for this principle.
Buzz?
Our mission with Andy's complete, Woody. And what's important now is we stay together.
He even turned down what's basically a VIP lounge at the daycare for their sake.
But I can't accept. We're a family. We stay together.
But screw that, man. Go get your boo, cowboy. Your new owner suddenly doesn't care about you anymore anyways. Speaking of which, hey Bonnie, remember promising Andy that you'd take good care of Woody after he told you how much he meant to him? No? Sheesh, even for a 5-year-old, that's low. Yeah, screw her, Woody. I'm sure she'll never reminisce about you or even question why you're gone at any point in her life whatsoever. And don't even get me started on Buzz. I might be alone in this, but Buzz Lightyear probably would have had the best character development across not just the Toy Story franchise, but every Pixar film as a whole, if it weren't for the 4th movie. My guy started off great as this oblivious toy with the memories of a fictional character, culminating into a surprisingly deep existential crisis. He then grew into a resourceful and kind-hearted father figure to the toys, who came to terms with who he is, thanks to the convictions that formed as a result of his bond with Woody and the events of the 1st film. Even in the 3rd film, where he was brainwashed half the time, I think audiences got to know him better in the minimal screen time he got than they ever did in the 4th film. Shit the fan, the toys think their owner abandoned them, and despite all that, Buzz believes that even if what brought them together is gone, as far as they know, they need to stay together because they're family. Where did the 4th film go from this? Oh, you know, just the guy who trusts the literal recordings attached to his body. Just because he's a plastic imitation of a character doesn't mean that the content should hold any real-world practicality. I get that these 4 films didn't have the exact same writing teams, but geez, man, take one moment to understand who you're writing instead of just trying to get laughs for the kids. Not to seem bitter, but who was laughing at these jokes anyways? Don't answer that. Honestly, all of these gripes just seem like repressed first world problems because from an outsider's perspective, these films are visually great and some of them are insultingly bad to a certain degree. I mean, it's Disney for crying out loud. You got the branding, the money for writers, artists, and animators, etc. Seriously, pick one of these films out of a hat and look up the budget. Yeah, there you go. Money really does solve most of your problems. These kind of things are usually the bare minimum with a studio this big. Although, to be fair, and credit where credit is due, some of these sequels are not completely bereft of the quality I'm being picky about. I think there's a handful of moments throughout some of these sequels that felt as if they had the depth, creative action, and/or the emotional impact of their predecessors. Basically what people were hoping for out of these films that isn't just nostalgia bait. I think the problem there is that there's just a real lack of consistency. Unfortunately, and in the grand scheme of things, it seems like producers, executives, and basically all the people in charge are bent on compromising any and all quality sometimes. The same quality that arguably won them all those Oscars. You know, back when they were worth taking seriously. Why do you ask? Well, my theory is that they make these decisions for the sake of the real breadwinners of these projects. You know what, let me put it this way without blabbing out the answer. Toy Story 4. A film about toys probably wouldn't have existed if it wasn't about toys.
You see what I'm doing here?
As far as I can tell, that's probably where a fair amount of this company's revenue comes from. Heck, just ask this other, completely random and totally obscure company where most of their money comes from. Is it from the games? The anime? Trading cards? The manga? Say it with me, kids. Merchandise! Largest media franchise in the world, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm willing to bet that things are too different for this film company that's got a lot in common with it. But to be fair, all this concrete information is either not publicly available or it's really hard to come by through internet research. In the end though, this is all just a theory. A marketing theory. Thanks for... but what do I know? It's not like filmographic production was my major in college or anything.
Wait a minute!
I really wouldn't have most of these gripes if Pixar, or really just Disney as a whole, kinda prides itself on the fact that even adults can enjoy what they create. Either that or they really work off the fact that too many of its age demographics are bigger than what they might have expected. Just try to think about it for a bit. I think we're at that point in our cultural zeitgeist where all the kids that grew up with the classic Disney films, hell including me, still want to enjoy whatever the company has to offer, for better or worse. I just wish it didn't all hinge on the money they make rather than, you know, how good the film actually is. All these years later, Hunchback of Notre Dame, still great. The GOAT! Lion King, still great. No, not that one. The Black Cauldron, pfft, Okay, maybe not all of them. You're not Miles Morales, man. You're allowed to save your dad and not screw up the multiverse in the process. You've pulled it off several times already. Please tell me someone's understanding this metaphor. Okay, let me put it in a more boring way. You can have your cake and eat it too. If you just commit to what should really matter. Fuck the deadlines, fuck the merch.
Fuck all these lunatic lawyers and chicken bureaucrats!
In layman's terms, just let him cook, man. Don't take it from me, though. I'm just some rando on the internet stating my thoughts for strangers on the internet. Take it from this guy instead. He's just, oh, you know, creator of some of the most influential and iconic cartoons of the 90s and 2000s. Seriously, is it just so much to hope for executives to put trust in the ideas that are pitched to them? Usually the marketing sets you for life anyways. You can't rush art. But in the end, these issues are just basically a part of show business. I know that in the grand scheme of things, this process is not as simple as I'm making it out to be, but it is a start. Be it films, music, or even games, we all gotta make compromises in what's more or less an entrepreneurial pursuit. Would most of Disney's and by extension Pixar's respectable catalog exist if it weren't for these dilemmas? Don't answer that, it's rhetorical. Look, I'm not here to vent too much. Okay, more than what I already have, about the consistent mediocrity or subversive disappointment that Pixar has had throughout the years. With all this being said though, imagine my shock when Inside Out 2 lacked a lot of these glaring issues. To be fair though, and as far as the criteria I mentioned are concerned, this franchise in particular isn't really held to some of these standards I mentioned. All this film is doing is visualizing what's going on inside a young girl's head. Not too many elements from the predecessors need to be taken into consideration, because outside of the literal emotions, the film is just about a girl going through genuine real-world problems. And the crazy part is, it's done way too well. It's like a good slice of life cartoon on steroids. It's not exactly meant to be too thrilling or engaging in general to begin with, and I think any good critic should understand that. But one thing that the sequel does have over the others is really just the fact that this storyline feels organic. Just because Nemo has to be found doesn't mean Dory eventually does too. But what happens after an 11-year-old going through the ropes of living in a new town and abandoning nearly everything she knew and loved?
Do it again.
Life's not over at 13. Something's gonna go wrong again soon enough. I don't mean to sound like a run-of-the-mill unhappy adult, but it do be like that sometimes. One line from the film single-handedly acknowledged this principle, and it almost broke me when I heard it in the movie theater. Maybe this is what happens when you grow up. You feel less joy. Not to project or give away too much information, but let's just say that hit a little too close to home, and I doubt I'm alone in that regard. Maybe the reason anyone can resonate with Riley, and by extension her literal emotions, is simply the fact that, well, she's only human. Everything she goes through just seems uncannily similar to issues I'd like to believe anyone has dealt with at some point, or eventually will. I'm no stranger to having friends having to leave me for one reason or another, to the point where I've never seen them again. Feeling like I have to accomplish something that's too much for me just to avoid condemning myself to loneliness, or feeling like I have to lie just to try to fit in with a new crowd. Either these anecdotes are a huge coincidence, or Riley's really just that relatable to some degree. Even when I'm trying to be impartial for the sake of this review, I still think Riley's problems were all genuinely compelling. These themes are arguably too similar to the first films, but definitely unique to the point where it holds a distinct and equally powerful message. Inside Out 1 was about understanding the purpose of emotions, while Inside Out 2 is about how you can't be defined by one emotion alone, neither positive or negative. Maybe these themes have a little too much in common, but there's one principle they share that's universally helpful in any and all emotional processes. Things will get better when you start being honest with yourself.
Own that shit.
Riley's sense of self was spouting, "I'm not good enough," or "I'm a good friend," repeatedly. It's easy to tell even for a 13-year-old who's frequently happy.
See, now that's some bullshit.
Anyone with presumably enough maturity will know that such an innocent and literal sense of self can't possibly be genuine, even for a 13-year-old girl who with a more or less healthy upbringing. All these suspicions really come into play when you see Joy and Sadness repressing all those bad memories, like Riley failing a test or getting penalized in her hockey match. Speaking of Joy and Sadness though, they really reflect their growth from the previous film, especially Joy. She straight up asks Sadness if she's ever led her astray without hesitation. Sadness responds, many times actually. It's great to see that Sadness isn't as obliviously somber as she was, and seeing both characters reflect their growth from the first film, which is apparently a lot to ask for out of Pixar sometimes, but I've said enough about that. As for the other three, well, I'm just glad that they actually contribute rather than just practically taking a backseat like in the first film. Anger resorting to using Pouchy as much as he hates it. Fear having a parachute ready because he's that plausibly paranoid. Yeah, I like it. Disgust reading into Bree and Grace's expressions because you could argue that cynicism is a form of disgust. I might be alone in this, but I'm completely unfazed by the fact that two of them got recast. Honestly, it doesn't feel distracting in any way. Maybe it's because I haven't seen the original film in several years, but also I'm not exactly longing for Bill Hader's voice work, and especially not Mindy Collins.
Know your place, trash.
Even when the emotions aren't contributing to the main narrative directly, their actions are creative, appropriate, or they play into another strength of the film, which definitely improved from the first. It was funnier. Comedy never really defined how good the first one was, but I appreciate the fact that it's even better this time around. The Cloud Strife knockoff, if that's what that was, the expressions, the new locations. Oh yeah, the world building got even better, at least as far as Riley's head is concerned, and it all actually adds up. The belief system, the sarcasm, the memory vaults, the new islands, it all makes sense in context, and it's common enough either way. Yeah, the 13-year-old is going to be a bit sarcastic, get emotional over petty things like being smelly, or she is going to prioritize her friends over her family to the point where the visualization is literally bigger, as sad as that might sound. Expanding the world organically is usually a respectable prerequisite for any good sequel, but in this kind of story, it can represent so much more, and they nail it. Also, Pixar, stop trying to make a wooga happen. It's not going to happen. It was funny the first time, which is the only good thing I can say about Turning Red, but now you're just pushing it. Artistically, especially watching this in theaters, this film just rears so many colors in so many instances. I've heard people say time and time again that you can't replicate the theater experience, and I didn't really get that until recently. Maybe it's just the whiplash of not going to a movie theater in almost 3 years. Oh god, it's been 3 years. But I love the vibrancy of moments like the memory avalanche flowing through the water and the particle spheres flowing out of the emotions. The former straight up felt like,
I'm gonna do an internet!
The latter moment, on the other hand, really built up to something special. At first, I thought it was just the studio telling the audience, our budget is big, we gotta look better. But no, it wasn't just some arbitrary art direction. That flow of energy, for lack of a better term, actually amounted to something meaningful in terms of the narrative. It's not necessarily something symbolic as far as I can tell, but the fact that something that was more or less taken for granted played into the plot so impactfully, it just doesn't seem very common. There's just so much nuance and subtlety even in the littlest of things, with this as an example. And better yet, it showcased the idea that for Riley, like any sport or hobby someone is passionate about, hockey is supposed to make her happy, culminating into a much more authentic belief system. Even before then, I love the gentle aesthetic of Riley's belief system. You know, before anxiety screwed with it, of course. There's just so many bits and pieces of colorful and compelling moments, and they're not always mutually exclusive. Seriously, I don't think I'm gonna enjoy this film whenever it drops on Disney Plus as much as I did in theaters. While I'm mentioning anxiety, though, I had my doubts when I first saw the trailers, and I honestly thought anxiety would be painfully overglorified to the point where audiences would misinterpret her character's messaging and motivations. Like some antagonists I know, but no, she made for a great and compelling antagonist. You can really grasp what she's going for, and it's not all blatant paranoia like her name would have you expect. The film really does go into enough detail as to why she does what she does, and it's not necessarily just because she's a living embodiment of insecurities. You could make a case that fear and anxiety are more or less the same, but the film makes a clear enough distinction, even if it's a bit of a reach to spare the new cast some redundancy. Maybe the plot would have been a little more interesting if Fear really served as the antagonist? Seriously, just think about it for a moment. You could argue that envy is a form of disgust, embarrassment and anxiety are forms of fear, and ennui is a form of sadness, but honestly, the compromise doesn't seem that shallow. I get that they wanted to introduce some new characters, even if most of them fell flat in their first impressions. Embarrassment had its moments, but ennui was just way too drab and stereotypical. Seriously, Gravity Falls did this shtick over a decade ago, and it really wasn't funny back then either. And Envy? Well, she's just way too lacking in screen time to leave any sort of lasting impact, in my opinion. I'm not really gonna count nostalgia because, well, the film cut her short on purpose, but I will disagree that you have to be the age the film implies to get that feeling. Also, that scene in the artist room depicting Riley's imagination, I'd say it makes for unsubtle but still funny commentary on the labors of cinematic artistry, but after everything I've talked about in this video, it seems a bit hypocritical on Disney's end. Not to say that I didn't enjoy it in some capacity, but I'd say the new cast members leave a lot to be desired. But for one, anxiety really carried, and 2, most of the film's runtime revolves around the first 5 emotions anyway. Like I said, I don't mind the stretches they're taking for introducing new characters, but that's only because they're not as consequential to the plot in this instance. Unlike, say, Incredibles 2, where the writers really expected me to give a shit about Boyd.
Who?
In terms of consequences though, the film's ending was just sublime. Maybe some people are displeased with the ambiguity, but I think the rhetoric of whether Riley made it into the Firehawks or not makes for a much sharper conclusion. In a few ways, it's like Pulp Fiction with the briefcase or the seed at the end of the Lorax. The book, definitely not the movie. There's no telling exactly what would happen, but audiences can understand the circumstances well enough to appreciate the ending, or at least take the time to think about them. Riley realized that even with Bree and Grace gone, she's still in touch with them, she doesn't have to be anxious or dishonest with her new friends, and even without the Firehawks, most if not all of her fears don't hold as much water as she thought they did. Like I implied earlier, a sense of honesty and, by extension, humility from her literal sense of self really came a long way in the grand scheme of things. All in all, the new characters' underwhelming impressions is really the only thing holding the film back from the blatant 10 out of 10 I want to give this film. But even then, I'd say it's still at least a minimum of 9. And with the amount of money it's made, second highest grossing animated film ever as of this recording, by the way, I think it deserves so much more than several others in this category. Especially this one. With all the talk I had of sequels, I just sincerely hope Pixar executives don't get the wrong idea from this film's success. Just because it's a sequel doesn't mean it'll be good, and vice versa, even if it makes a lot of money. All I can do is continue to suggest that people shouldn't lose sight of what's really important. Hell, that's basically the message of yet another Disney film. Knowing all this, maybe I should encourage people to go watch Elio strictly out of principle. Would you look at that? A Pixar movie about a 13-year-old girl and the literal and/or allegorical ramifications of puberty that isn't an uncompelling, self-righteous, and narratively inconsistent clusterfuck.